A blood oath that couldn't be forgiven. Bianca Vitali had never feared the men her father did business with until the night he lost everything. When his empire collapsed, she learned a brutal truth: she was collateral. And Matteo Greco? He was collecting. He tilted his glass, watching her with quiet amusement. "Your father made his choices," he murmured. "Now I make yours." Chapter 1. The Fall of the Vitali Empire. The clink of crystal against crystal, a sound Bianca Vitali had once found comforting, now echoed like a death knell in the cavernous dining room. The scent of her father's favorite Barolo, usually a prelude to laughter and boisterous conversation, hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken dread. Outside, the Roman night was a velvet curtain, punctuated by the distant wail of sirens, a soundtrack to the unraveling of their world. Bianca, at 58, still possessed the striking beauty that had once graced the covers of Italian magazines. Her silver-streaked, dark hair was swept back in a severe chignon, highlighting the sharp angles of her face, the fine lines etched around her emerald eyes, lines that spoke of a life lived in luxury, yes, but also of a quiet strength, a resilience forged in the fires of observation. She had always been the quiet observer, the daughter who saw more than she spoke, who understood the nuances of her father's world without ever fully being a part of it. Tonight, however, the nuances were replaced by stark, brutal realities. Her father, Don Antonio Vitali, a man who had always seemed as immutable as the Colosseum itself, sat slumped in his high-backed chair, his usually immaculate suit rumpled, his face ashen. The remnants of a lavish meal, plates of half-eaten osso buco, bowls of untouched risotto lay scattered across the mahogany table, a grotesque still life of a feast interrupted. Across from him sat three men, their faces grim, their eyes devoid of the usual deference they showed Don Antonio. These were not guests, they were vultures, circling the dying carcass of the Vitali Empire. Sal DeMarco, with his slicked-back hair and cold, reptilian eyes, was the most vocal. He had been Antonio's consigliere, his trusted advisor, for decades. Now he was the executioner. Antonio, DeMarco's voice was smooth, oiled with a false sympathy that made Bianca's skin crawl. "We've been over this. The debts are insurmountable. The losses catastrophic." Antonio raised a trembling hand, a gesture that once commanded instant obedience. Now it was met with stony silence. "Sal, there must be something, some way." His voice, usually a booming baritone, was a ragged whisper. "There was a way." Another man, Lorenzo Rossi, interjected. Rossi, a capo in the Vitali family, was a mountain of a man, his bulk straining against the confines of his expensive suit. "You chose poorly." Bianca knew what he meant. Her father's gamble, a massive investment in a rival family's territory, had backfired spectacularly. It was a move born of desperation, a last-ditch attempt to reclaim the glory days of the Vitali family, days that had been fading, like a watercolor in the rain, for years. The third man, a silent shadow named Enzo, simply watched, his hand resting casually on the table, close to the subtle bulge beneath his jacket. He was DeMarco's enforcer, the silent promise of violence that underscored every word spoken. Bianca's gaze drifted to the window. The sirens were closer now, their mournful cry a premonition of the chaos to come. She had always known this world was built on shifting sands, on alliances forged and broken with the ease of a whispered promise. She had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, the forced smiles at family gatherings, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She had learned to read the unspoken language of power, the subtle cues that betrayed the underlying tension, the ever-present threat of violence. Her father finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a despair so profound it stole the air from her lungs. He hadn't looked at her like that since her mother had died, 15 years ago, a victim of a stray bullet meant for him. That look, that raw, unadulterated grief, had been a turning point in Bianca's life. It was the moment she truly understood the cost of her father's world. "Bianca," he began, his voice cracking. DeMarco cut him off. "There is one matter left to discuss, Antonio." A matter of compensation. He paused, letting the word hang in the air, heavy with implication. The Greco deal. Bianca's blood ran cold. The Grecos. They were a different breed, a family steeped in ancient traditions and a ruthlessness that made even her father's organization seem tame. Matteo Greco, the current head of the family, was a legend whispered in hushed tones, a man of ice and fire, of unwavering loyalty and brutal vengeance. What about the Grecos? Antonio asked, his voice barely audible. DeMarco smiled, a cruel, predatory smile that revealed teeth stained yellow from years of expensive cigars. The agreement stands. You offered collateral in exchange for certain favors. Bianca felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Collateral. She knew the term, of course. It was the language of business, of deals struck in the shadows. But she had never imagined her father's eyes met hers again, and this time, there was a flicker of something else in them, something beyond despair. It was a plea, a silent apology, a confirmation of her worst fears. No, Bianca said, her voice surprisingly steady. Absolutely not. DeMarco's smile widened. My dear Bianca, you have no say in this. This was your father's agreement. And now he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. It is yours to fulfill. The room shifted. The beautiful objects, once reflections of home and safety, now seemed alien. The very air felt thick with finality. She had thought the worst had already occurred, her father's downfall, but this was the cruelest of betrayals, and somehow, the one she'd always expected. Chapter 2. Collateral damage. The word hung in the air, a poison dart aimed directly at Bianca's heart. Collateral. She repeated it silently, the syllables tasting like ash in her mouth. It was a word she'd heard whispered in hushed tones throughout her life, a word that belonged to the shadowy world her father inhabited, a world she had always tried to keep at arm's length. Now it had reached out and ensnared her, pulling her into the darkness she had so desperately tried to avoid. You can't be serious, Bianca said, her voice rising in a mixture of disbelief and outrage. She looked at her father, searching for any sign of denial, any indication that this was some cruel joke. But his face was a mask of resignation, his eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored her own growing dread. DeMarco chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. Oh, I assure you, Signorina Vitali, I am very serious. Your father made a bargain. A desperate one, perhaps, but a binding one nonetheless. He gestured towards Enzo, the silent enforcer, who remained motionless, a statue carved from granite and menace. We are simply here to collect. Collect what? Bianca demanded, her voice trembling with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. What possible collateral could I be? DeMarco leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. You, my dear, are the key to securing a strategic alliance with the Greco family. A marriage, to be precise. The room spun. Bianca felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Marriage? To a Greco? It was unthinkable. The Grecos were legends, whispered about in hushed tones, a family steeped in ancient traditions and a ruthlessness that dwarfed even her father's. And Matteo Greco, the head of the family, was the most infamous of them all. Matteo Greco, Bianca said, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. She had seen him once, years ago, at a charity gala. He had been a striking figure, tall and powerfully built, with eyes that seemed to pierce through her, assessing her with a cold, calculating gaze. Even then, she had sensed a darkness about him, a dangerous aura that had both terrified and fascinated her. Indeed, DeMarco confirmed. Don Antonio, in his wisdom, offered you as a bride to solidify the deal. A way to unite the two families, to ensure cooperation. Bianca turned to her father, her eyes blazing with betrayal. You did this? You promised me to him? Without even telling me? Antonio flinched under her gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a broken man, stripped of his power, his dignity, his very soul. He had no choice, Rossi interjected, his voice heavy with a mixture of pity and contempt. The debts were too great. The losses irreversible. This was the only way to salvage anything, to protect what was left. Protect?
Bianca scoffed.
Protect what? Your own hides? You're selling me off like a piece of property to save yourselves. It's not like that, Bianca, Antonio finally managed to say, his voice a ragged whisper. It's for the family. For our legacy. Legacy? Bianca laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. What legacy? You've destroyed everything. And now you expect me to sacrifice my life, my freedom, for some twisted notion of family honor? The sirens outside were growing louder, their insistent wail a constant reminder of the collapsing world around her. The police were coming, she knew. They would raid the villa, seize the assets, arrest her father. But that was a secondary concern now. Her immediate future was being decided in this room, by these men, and she was powerless to stop it. Enzo finally stirred, his hand moving slightly towards the bulge beneath his jacket. The silent threat was clear. Resistance was futile. Bianca closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. She had always been a survivor. She had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of her father's world, to adapt to the ever-shifting landscape of power and betrayal. She would survive this, too, but on her own terms. Fine, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. I'll do it. I'll marry Matteo Greco. The men exchanged surprised glances. They had expected tears, pleas, perhaps even a desperate attempt to escape. They hadn't expected this quiet acceptance, this steely resolve. But Bianca continued, her eyes locking onto DeMarco's. I have conditions. DeMarco raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Conditions? You are in no position to bargain, Signorina Vitali. Perhaps not, Bianca said, her voice gaining strength.
But I am still a Vitali.
And I will not be treated like a pawn. I will meet with Matteo Greco. Alone. And I will decide for myself if this alliance is something I can accept. A tense silence filled the room. DeMarco considered her words, his eyes narrowed in thought. He knew that forcing her into this marriage against her will would be a risky proposition. A resentful bride could be a dangerous enemy, especially within the volatile world of the Mafia. Very well, he finally said, a grudging respect flickering in his eyes. We will arrange a meeting. But understand this, Signorina Vitali. The deal stands. Your father's fate, and perhaps your own, depends on your cooperation. He rose from his chair, signaling the others to follow. As they left, Bianca remained standing, her gaze fixed on the empty doorway. The sirens had stopped. The silence that descended was even more ominous, broken only by the frantic beat of her heart. The world outside these walls now carried a tangible presence of doom, and she wondered if she would ever be able to breathe free air again. She did not know what awaited with Matteo Greco, but she knew that it will be a fight. She would have to choose to win. Chapter 3. The Greco Proposition. The meeting was arranged with a chilling efficiency that spoke volumes about the Greco's influence. No grand announcements, no formal invitations, just a terse phone call from DeMarco, informing Bianca of the time and place, a secluded villa overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, an hour's drive outside of Rome. The location itself was a statement, a demonstration of power and control. It was Greco territory, a place where Bianca would be utterly at their mercy. The drive was a blur of winding coastal roads and breathtaking scenery that Bianca was too numb to appreciate. She sat in the back of a sleek, black car, driven by one of DeMarco's men, a silent, hulking figure who seemed to emanate an aura of barely contained violence. She had dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant black dress, a symbol of mourning, perhaps, but also of defiance. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the strong lines of her face, the determined set of her jaw. She would not cower. She would not beg. She would face Matteo Greco on her own terms, whatever those might be. The villa was a masterpiece of understated opulence. It was not ostentatious, like some of the Vitali properties, but it exuded a quiet power, a sense of ancient wealth, and unwavering authority. The walls were made of pale stone, weathered by centuries of sea air, and the grounds were meticulously manicured, with lush gardens and fountains that whispered secrets to the wind. Bianca was led through a series of cool, dimly lit corridors, the silence broken only by the soft tap of her heels on the marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of old money and something else, something darker, more primal, the scent of power, of danger, of the unknown. Finally, she was ushered into a large, airy room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the sea. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the walls in hues of orange and gold. And there, standing by the window, his back to her, was Matteo Greco. He turned as she entered, and Bianca felt her breath catch in her throat. He was even more striking than she remembered. Tall and lean, with a body honed by years of rigorous training, he moved with a grace that belied his underlying power. His hair was dark, almost black, and his eyes, the color of deep sea, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was dressed casually, in a dark shirt and trousers, but even in simple clothes, he exuded an aura of command, of absolute authority. "Signorina Vitali," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "I've been expecting you." Bianca forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Signor Greco," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. "I believe we have something to discuss." He gestured towards a pair of armchairs facing the window. "Indeed, we do. Please sit." Bianca took a seat, carefully arranging her dress around her. She noticed that a bottle of wine and 2 glasses had been placed on a small table between the chairs. It was a Chianti Classico, she saw, a wine known for its bold flavor and complex structure, a fitting choice for the situation. Matteo poured 2 glasses, offering one to Bianca. She accepted it, taking a small sip, letting the wine linger on her tongue. It was exquisite, as she had expected. Everything about this man, about this place, was exquisite, refined, and utterly terrifying. "Your father," Matteo began, his eyes never leaving hers, "made a rather unwise decision." Bianca nodded, her gaze unwavering.
He did.
"And now, I am here to deal with the consequences." "The consequences," Matteo repeated, swirling the wine in his glass, "are significant. Your father's debts are substantial. His empire in ruins." "I am aware of the situation," Bianca said, her voice tight. "I am also aware that I am being offered as collateral to settle those debts." Matteo smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Collateral is a rather crude term. Wouldn't you agree? I prefer to think of it as a strategic alliance, a union of 2 families, a merging of strengths. A marriage," Bianca said bluntly. "That is what we are talking about, is it not?" "Marriage is a sacred institution," Matteo said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "It is not something to be entered into lightly. But it can also be a powerful tool, a way to achieve mutual benefit." "And what benefit would I gain from this alliance?" Bianca asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. Matteo leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Survival," he said softly. "Protection. A chance to rebuild what your father has destroyed. And," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, "perhaps something more." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Bianca felt a shiver run down her spine. He was offering her a way out, a lifeline in a sea of despair. But at what cost? Her freedom? Her independence? Her very soul? Bianca set her glass on the table and stood. She turned to the expansive windows. The waves below crashed in a steady rhythm, a timeless presence that had seen empires rise and fall. "I need time to think," she stated plainly. Matteo didn't move from his seat. He simply watched her, that same intense gaze fixed upon her. "Time is a luxury neither of us possess, Signorina Vitali. Your father's creditors are not known for their patience." His voice was soft, but the underlying threat was clear. She could hear the slight rustle of his clothing as he stood and walked toward her. The scent of his cologne, clean and with a hint of something wild, wafted toward her. It was both inviting and threatening. The nearness of him was doing things to her resolve, to her senses, that she could not name and did not like. She finally turned to face him, keeping a safe distance. She could see every line on his face now, the faint scar above his left eye, the small creases at the corner of his lips. She had not allowed herself to truly study him earlier, so shocked and guarded, but now she saw something there, in the depths of his dark, sea-like eyes. It was not tenderness, not kindness, no, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was more a weariness. I need to know, Bianca started, the words catching slightly in her throat. I need to know that this is not that I am not simply another object to be traded. He studied her for a long moment and then gave the smallest nod. I will give you until sunrise. He spoke softly. But know this. The offer will not remain indefinitely. And with that, he stepped back, the distance between them widening. Chapter 4.
En une jolie alliance.
Sunrise. The word echoed in Bianca's mind throughout the long, restless night. It was a deadline, a point of no return. She had been given a reprieve, a few precious hours to contemplate a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. But the more she thought, the more she realized that she had no real choice. Her father's actions had painted her into a corner, leaving her with only one path forward, a marriage to Matteo Greco. She had spent the night in one of the villa's guest rooms, a lavishly appointed space that felt more like a gilded cage. The silk sheets, the antique furniture, the breathtaking view of the moonlit sea, all of it was a constant reminder of the opulent prison she was about to enter. She had barely slept, tossing and turning, her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions, 1,000 unspoken fears. What kind of man was Matteo Greco? She had seen glimpses of his power, his ruthlessness, his undeniable charisma. But she had also seen something else, that fleeting flicker of weariness in his eyes, a hint of vulnerability that had surprised her. Was he truly as cold and calculating as his reputation suggested? Or was there something more beneath the surface, something hidden behind the mask of the Mafia Don? And what about her own feelings? She was terrified, of course. This was not the life she had ever envisioned for herself. She had always craved independence, freedom, a chance to escape the suffocating constraints of her father's world. But she was also intrigued. Matteo Greco was a challenge, an enigma, a man who stirred something within her, a mixture of fear and fascination that she couldn't quite explain. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, Bianca rose from the bed, her decision made. She would marry Matteo Greco. She would enter into this unholy alliance, not out of love, not out of desire, but out of necessity. It was the only way to protect her father, to salvage what remained of her family's legacy, to survive. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple white dress, a symbol of surrender, perhaps, but also of a new beginning. She left her hair down, letting it cascade over her shoulders, a small act of defiance in the face of the overwhelming power she was about to confront. She found Matteo in the same room where they had met the previous evening. He was standing by the window, watching the sunrise, his silhouette outlined against the fiery sky. He turned as she entered, his eyes searching hers, looking for an answer. "I've made my decision," Bianca said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "I will marry you, Signor Greco." A flicker of something relief, perhaps, or even satisfaction crossed his face. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I expected no less," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are a Vitali after all. You understand the importance of duty." "Duty," Bianca repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Yes, I understand duty. But I also understand the need for respect." Matteo raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Respect? And what do you expect in that regard, Signorina Vitali?" "I expect to be treated as an equal partner in this alliance," Bianca said, her voice gaining strength. "I will not be a trophy wife, a silent ornament to adorn your arm. I will have a voice, a say in matters that concern me, my family, and our future." Matteo studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowed in thought. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her resolve. Finally, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that, for the first time, seemed to reach his eyes. "You surprise me, Signorina Vitali," he said. "I had expected submission, but I see now that you are made of sterner stuff." He paused, then added, "Very well. I agree to your terms. You will be my wife, but you will also be my consigliera. Your voice will be heard, your opinions valued." Bianca felt a surge of something she hadn't expected. Hope. Perhaps this marriage wouldn't be the prison she had feared. Perhaps, within the confines of this unholy alliance, she could find a way to carve out a space for herself, to retain some semblance of her independence, her identity. "There is one more thing," Bianca said, her voice hesitant. "My father. I need your assurance that he will be protected." Matteo's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "Your father," he said, his voice hardening, "has made many enemies. His life is precarious." But he added, his eyes meeting hers, "As your husband, I will ensure his safety. He will be under my protection, as will you." Bianca nodded, accepting his terms. She knew that she was making a deal with the devil, that she was entering into a world of danger and uncertainty. But she also knew that she had no other choice. She was a Vitali, and she would do whatever it took to protect her family, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness, her own freedom. Matteo stepped closer, his presence filling the room. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. His touch was surprisingly gentle, sending a shiver down her spine. "Welcome to the family, Bianca," he said, his voice a soft whisper. "You will find that life with the Grecos is different. But it is also exciting." His eyes held hers, and for a moment, Bianca saw something beyond the darkness, something that hinted at a shared understanding, a shared destiny. It was a fleeting glimpse, a spark of something she couldn't quite define, but it was enough to make her wonder if this unholy alliance might, just might, lead to something more than she had ever dared to hope for. The weight of his words settled, the reality sinking in. As he released her, she had to force herself not to lean into the warmth that had been abruptly taken away. She knew, as the morning light illuminated the room, that the die was cast, and there was no looking back. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Shadows. The transition was swift, brutal, and utterly disorienting. One moment, Bianca was a Vitali, living in the familiar, albeit crumbling, world of her father. The next, she was a Greco, swept away into a whirlwind of ancient rituals, unspoken rules, and veiled threats. The marriage ceremony itself was a stark contrast to the lavish affairs she had attended in the past. It was a small, private affair, held in a centuries-old chapel on the Greco estate, attended only by a handful of close family members and associates. There were no white doves, no cascading flowers, no joyful celebrations. Instead, there was a somber atmosphere, a sense of solemn obligation, of a pact being sealed, not with love, but with the weight of generations of tradition and the cold, hard reality of power. Bianca wore the white dress she had chosen, but it felt more like a shroud than a wedding gown. Matteo, in a dark suit that emphasized his imposing figure, stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and protective. The priest, a wizened old man with eyes that seemed to see into her soul, spoke in Latin, his words echoing through the silent chapel. Bianca understood the vows, of course, but they felt hollow, devoid of the emotion, the promise of a shared future that she had always associated with marriage. This was a transaction, a merging of assets, a consolidation of power. After the ceremony, there was a brief, formal reception in the villa's grand ballroom. The guests, a mixture of Greco family members and trusted allies, greeted Bianca with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She was an outsider, a Vitali, brought in to solidify an alliance, to settle a debt. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing her, judging her, wondering if she was worthy of the Greco name. Matteo remained by her side, introducing her to the key players in his world. There was his uncle, Enzo Greco, a man even older than her father, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and scars, his eyes still sharp and alert, filled with a chilling intelligence. There was Isabella, Matteo's younger sister, a beautiful, fiery woman with a rebellious streak that reminded Bianca of her younger self. And there was Marco, Matteo's consigliere, a man of quiet confidence and unwavering loyalty, his gaze constantly scanning the room, assessing potential threats. Bianca navigated the reception with a forced smile and a carefully constructed facade of composure. She answered their questions politely, offered the appropriate pleasantries, but inside, she felt like an imposter, a stranger in a strange land. She missed the familiar chaos of her father's household, the boisterous laughter, the heated arguments, even the constant undercurrent of danger. This world was different. It was quieter, more controlled, but the danger was even more palpable, lurking beneath the surface, like a serpent coiled and ready to strike. As the evening wore on, Bianca began to notice the whispers, the subtle glances, the unspoken messages that passed between the guests. She realized that she was not just entering a new family, she was entering a web of secrets, of hidden alliances and long-standing feuds. The Grecos were not a monolithic entity, they were a collection of individuals, each with their own agendas, their own ambitions, their own loyalties. "You seem unsettled," Matteo said, his voice a low murmur in her ear. He had been watching her closely, observing her interactions with his family, noticing the subtle tension in her shoulders, the guarded expression in her eyes. Bianca forced a smile. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted. "Your world is different from what I'm used to." "Different, yes," Matteo agreed. "But also powerful. You are a Greco now, Bianca. You have access to resources, to influence, that you never had before. And what is expected of me in return?" Bianca asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Matteo's hand tightened on her waist. "Loyalty," he said, his voice hardening. "Absolute, unwavering loyalty. That is the price of belonging to this family. That is the price of protection." Bianca nodded, understanding the unspoken threat. She was a Greco now, but she was also a prisoner, bound by the vows she had taken, by the debt her father had incurred. She was a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand, a game where the stakes were life and death. Later that night, as she lay alone in the vast, opulent bedroom that was now hers, Bianca listened to the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. The sea, once a symbol of freedom and escape, now seemed like a vast, impenetrable barrier, separating her from everything she had ever known. She was surrounded by luxury, by power, by the promise of a new life, but she had never felt so alone. The whispers followed her, even in her dreams. She heard the voices of her father, of DeMarco, of Matteo, all blending together in a cacophony of threats and promises, of obligations and betrayals. She saw the faces of the Greco family, their eyes filled with suspicion, with judgment, with a chilling indifference to her fate. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew that she had to find a way to navigate this treacherous world, to earn the trust of the Grecos, to protect herself and her father. She had to learn the rules of the game, the unspoken codes, the hidden alliances. She had to become a Greco, not just in name, but in spirit. As the first glimmer of dawn seeped into the room, Bianca looked out to sea. The whispers seemed to gather there, along the shoreline, but she knew that she had to find a way to understand them, to turn them into something that would benefit her, protect her. She would have to unravel the secrets surrounding her before they swallowed her whole. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. The silence of the Greco household was a stark contrast to the boisterous, often chaotic, atmosphere of the Vitali villa. It wasn't a peaceful silence, a quiet serenity. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, filled with unspoken words, hidden agendas, and simmering tensions. It was the silence of a family that had learned to communicate in whispers, in glances, in subtle gestures, a family that had mastered the art of concealing their true feelings, their true intentions. Bianca found herself struggling to adapt to this new environment. She was used to open arguments, to passionate outbursts, to the raw, unfiltered emotions that were a constant presence in her father's world. Here, everything was veiled, concealed, shrouded in a layer of secrecy that she found both suffocating and intriguing. She spent her days exploring the vast estate, familiarizing herself with its labyrinthine corridors, its hidden gardens, its secret passageways. The villa was a microcosm of the Greco world, a place of beauty and danger, of opulence and decay, of ancient traditions and modern anxieties. She tried to engage with the members of the family, to break through the walls of reserve that surrounded them. She spoke with Isabella, Matteo's sister, who seemed to share her rebellious spirit, her disdain for the rigid constraints of their world. She listened to Enzo, Matteo's uncle, who recounted stories of the family's past, of their struggles, their triumphs, their betrayals. She observed Marco, Matteo's consigliere, who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, assessing potential threats. But despite her efforts, Bianca remained an outsider, a stranger in a strange land. She was treated with courtesy, with respect, but there was always a distance, a subtle barrier that prevented her from truly connecting with them. She was a Greco in name, but not in spirit. She was Matteo's wife, but she was not his confidant, his partner, his equal. Matteo himself remained an enigma. He was attentive, courteous, even affectionate at times, but there was always a part of him that he held back, a hidden core that she couldn't penetrate. He treated her with a mixture of respect and possessiveness, as if she were a valuable acquisition, a prized possession, but not necessarily a person he truly understood or trusted. "You seem lost," Matteo said one evening, as they sat together in the library, surrounded by shelves filled with ancient tomes and leather-bound books. He had been watching her, observing her struggles, noticing the subtle sadness in her eyes, the quiet desperation that she tried so hard to conceal. Bianca sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I feel like I'm drowning," she admitted. "In silence, in secrets, in a world I don't understand." Matteo nodded, his gaze softening slightly.
It takes time, he said.
"This family, we have our ways. We have learned to protect ourselves, to guard our secrets, to trust no one. But I am your wife," Bianca said, her voice rising slightly. "Shouldn't I be an exception? Shouldn't I be trusted?" Matteo reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Trust," he said, his voice a low murmur, "is earned, Bianca. It is not given freely, especially in our world." "And how do I earn it?" Bianca asked, her eyes searching his. Matteo's gaze held hers, and for a moment, Bianca saw a flicker of something vulnerability, perhaps, or even a hint of longing. "By proving your loyalty," he said. "By showing that you are willing to embrace our ways, to accept our traditions, to protect our secrets." "And what if I can't?" Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if I can't become someone I'm not?" Matteo's hand tightened around hers. "Then you will be lost," he said, his voice hardening. "You will be an outsider, forever trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Bianca knew that he was right. She was at a crossroads, a point of no return. She had to choose, either embrace the Greco world, with all its darkness and its secrets, or remain forever on the periphery, an alien, a stranger, a prisoner in her own home. She spent the next few days in quiet contemplation, weighing her options, trying to find a way forward. She realized that she couldn't simply reject the Greco world. She had to find a way to navigate it, to adapt to it, to make it her own. She had to learn the language of silence, the art of concealment, the subtle cues that revealed the true intentions of those around her. She began studying. Not books, though the library offered an overwhelming supply. No, she studied people. She would watch Isabella argue with her brother in hushed tones, the words almost soundless, but the tension between them radiating outwards like heat. She witnessed Marco deliver a message to Matteo, a message that required no words. It was all in the eyes, the slight tightening of a jaw, the barely perceptible shift in posture. She began to realize that silence was not empty. It held power. One morning, she decided to take a risk. There had been hushed conversations, small gestures that she'd noted, all around a single name. Lorenzo. The name of one of the men from the night her father fell. Bianca found Matteo alone in his study. She simply entered and said the name. Lorenzo. Matteo looked up, surprised, and perhaps a little wary. She waited. The silence stretched, but Bianca held her ground, meeting his gaze steadily. Finally, Matteo gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the smallest of cracks in the wall, but it was a start. The silence had finally given up a secret, and Bianca knew that it would not be the last. It was in the very air around her, and now she was starting to breathe it in. Chapter 7. A Glimmer of Defiance. The small victory, the almost imperceptible nod from Matteo in response to her utterance of Lorenzo, was a turning point for Bianca. It was a confirmation that she was beginning to understand the language of the Grecos, the subtle cues, the unspoken messages that flowed beneath the surface of their carefully constructed silence. It was a glimmer of hope, a sign that she was not entirely lost, that she could find a way to navigate this treacherous world, to earn their trust, to carve out a space for herself. But it was also a dangerous game. Bianca knew that she was walking a tightrope, that one wrong step, one misinterpretation, could lead to disaster. The Grecos were a family steeped in secrets, in hidden alliances and long-standing feuds. They were not a family to be trifled with, and they would not hesitate to punish those who betrayed them, who threatened their power, who dared to challenge their authority. Bianca continued her quiet observations, her subtle investigations. She spent hours in the library, poring over old family records, searching for clues, for any hint of the truth behind the whispers, the rumors, the veiled threats that circulated within the Greco household. She listened to Isabella's complaints, to Enzo's reminiscences, to Marco's cryptic pronouncements, trying to piece together the puzzle, to understand the complex web of relationships and rivalries that defined this family. She also began to assert herself, to challenge the unspoken rules, to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable behavior for a Greco wife. She refused to be confined to the role of a silent ornament, a decorative accessory to Matteo's power. She insisted on accompanying him to meetings, on attending family gatherings, on being involved in the discussions, the decisions that shaped their lives. At first, her defiance was met with resistance, with disapproval, with subtle warnings from Matteo and his family. They were not used to a woman who spoke her mind, who challenged their authority, who dared to question their traditions. They were used to submission, to obedience, to the quiet acceptance of their place in the hierarchy. "You are playing a dangerous game, Bianca," Matteo warned her one evening after she had openly disagreed with him during a meeting with some of his associates. "You are testing my patience and the patience of my family." "I am not playing a game," Bianca retorted, her voice firm, her eyes unwavering. "I am trying to understand your world, to find my place in it. And I will not be silenced. I will not be treated as a child, a pawn, a piece of property." Matteo's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. He was clearly angered by her defiance, but there was also a flicker of something else in his gaze: admiration, perhaps, or even respect. He was a man who valued strength, who respected courage, and he could see that Bianca possessed both in abundance. "You are a Vitali," he said, his voice softening slightly. "You have fire in your blood, but you must learn to control it, to use it wisely. Otherwise, it will consume you." Bianca nodded, acknowledging his warning. She knew that she was taking risks, that she was pushing the limits of his tolerance. But she also knew that she couldn't simply surrender, that she couldn't allow herself to be swallowed up by the Greco world, to lose her identity, her voice, her sense of self. She began to cultivate allies, to build relationships with those members of the family who seemed more open to her, more willing to accept her as she was. She spent time with Isabella, sharing stories, exchanging confidences, forging a bond of sisterhood that transcended the boundaries of their family's rivalry. She listened to Enzo's advice, learning from his vast experience, his deep understanding of the Mafia's intricate workings. She even began to develop a grudging respect for Marco, Matteo's consigliere, recognizing his unwavering loyalty, his quiet competence, his ability to anticipate danger. One afternoon, Bianca was walking in the gardens with Isabella when the younger woman confessed something that made Bianca realize the depth of her own potential influence. "Matteo listens to you," Isabella had said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "He might not show it, but he values your opinion, more than he ever valued hers." Bianca was startled. "Hers?" Isabella hesitated, then sighed.
Elena.
Matteo's first wife. It was the first time Bianca had heard any mention of a previous wife. The revelation, although delivered softly, had struck her with a jolt. She knew little of Matteo's history, other than the whispers, the rumors, the fragmented stories she'd gleaned from her time here. And now this. A dead wife. A secret kept in the silence. What happened to her? Bianca asked, trying to keep her voice casual, betraying none of the sudden turmoil she felt inside. Isabella looked away, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon.
"It's a long story," she said.
"A sad story. One that is not spoken of often in this house." Bianca remained silent, waiting for Isabella to continue. She knew that she was treading on dangerous ground, that she was venturing into territory that was forbidden, that was shrouded in secrecy. But she also knew that she had to learn the truth, that she had to understand the past in order to navigate the present, to protect herself and her future. The silence had once again provided a crack, a glimmer, and this one, she knew, was significant. Chapter 8. The Masks We Wear. Isabella's reluctance to speak about Elena, Matteo's deceased first wife, only fueled Bianca's curiosity. The silence surrounding Elena's life and death was even thicker, more oppressive than the usual Greco silence. It was a silence born of pain, of grief, of a secret too terrible to be spoken aloud. Bianca knew that she had to tread carefully. Directly questioning Matteo was out of the question. He would simply shut down, retreat behind his wall of icy reserve. She had to find another way, a more subtle approach, to uncover the truth. She began to observe Matteo more closely, watching for any flicker of emotion, any hint of vulnerability that might betray his hidden feelings about Elena. She noticed the way his eyes darkened when certain topics were mentioned, the way his hand clenched into a fist when he thought no one was looking, the way he sometimes stared out at the sea, his gaze lost in the distant horizon, as if searching for something, someone he had lost. She also continued her conversations with Isabella, gently probing, subtly questioning, trying to glean any information she could without raising suspicion. Isabella was hesitant at first, reluctant to betray her brother's confidence, to break the unspoken code of silence that governed their family. But she also trusted Bianca. She saw her as an ally, a kindred spirit, someone who understood the suffocating constraints of their world. Elena was different, Isabella confided one afternoon, as they sat together in the villa's sun-drenched conservatory. She was not like us. She was fragile. She couldn't handle the pressure, the demands, the darkness of our world. What happened to her? Bianca asked, her voice soft, her eyes filled with compassion. Isabella hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "She died," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was ruled an accident, a fall from the cliffs." But she trailed off, leaving the unspoken words hanging in the air. Bianca knew what she was implying. Elena's death had not been an accident. It had been something more sinister, something hidden beneath the surface, something that the Grecos had covered up, buried beneath their layers of secrets and lies. "And Matteo?" Bianca asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How did he react?" Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "He was devastated," she said. "He loved her, you know, in his own way. But he also blamed her. For her weakness, for her inability to adapt, for her failure." Bianca felt a chill run down her spine. She understood now the source of Matteo's darkness, his coldness, his inability to trust. He had loved and lost, and the experience had hardened him, had made him even more determined to control everything, everyone around him. He had built a wall around his heart, a fortress of ice and stone, to protect himself from ever feeling that kind of pain again. Bianca realized that she was not just fighting for her own survival, she was fighting for Matteo's soul. She was trying to break through his defenses to reach the wounded, vulnerable man beneath the mask of the Mafia Don. It was a daunting task, a seemingly impossible mission, but she was determined to try. She had come to care for Matteo, despite his flaws, despite his darkness, despite the danger he represented. She saw something in him, a flicker of humanity, a spark of goodness, that she believed she could nurture, could bring back to life. She began to challenge him, not with defiance, but with empathy, with understanding. She spoke to him about her own losses, her own struggles, her own fears. She shared her memories of her mother, of the pain of her death, of the way it had shaped her life. She tried to create a connection, a bond of shared vulnerability that might allow him to open up, to reveal his true feelings, to let go of the past. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony, watching the sunset over the sea, Bianca took a risk. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her fingers lingering on his skin. "Matteo," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with compassion. "I know you've been hurt. I know you've lost someone you loved. But you can't keep living in the past. You have to let go of the pain, the guilt, the anger." Matteo stiffened, his body tensing under her touch. He turned to her, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "You know nothing about my pain," he said, his voice cold, his words clipped. "You know nothing about my past." "I know that you're wearing a mask," Bianca said, her voice unwavering. "That you're hiding your true feelings, your true self, behind a wall of ice. But I also know that there's a heart beating beneath that mask, a heart that's capable of love, of compassion, of forgiveness." Matteo's eyes searched hers, and for a moment, Bianca saw a flicker of something vulnerability, perhaps, or even a hint of hope. But then, the mask slipped back into place, the wall of ice reformed, and he turned away, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Leave it alone, Bianca." He spoke, his voice flat. She knew he was pushing her away, that she had reached a boundary he was not willing to cross. But she also knew that she had planted a seed of doubt, a seed of hope that might, just might, eventually blossom into something more. The masks people wear were meant to protect, but Bianca was slowly learning that, within this family, they could also imprison. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Past. Matteo's curt dismissal, "Leave it alone, Bianca," echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the walls he had erected around his heart. But Bianca was not one to be easily deterred. She had come too far, endured too much, to simply back down now. She was determined to understand Matteo, to unravel the mystery of Elena's death, to break through the silence that shrouded the Greco family's past. She knew that she had to proceed with caution, that any direct confrontation would only push Matteo further away. She had to find another way, a more subtle approach, to uncover the truth. She decided to focus on Enzo, Matteo's uncle, the family patriarch, the keeper of their secrets, the guardian of their traditions. Enzo was a formidable figure, a man of few words and even fewer emotions. He had seen it all, done it all, survived it all. He was a living repository of the Greco family history, a walking encyclopedia of their triumphs and their tragedies. Bianca knew that if anyone held the key to unlocking the mystery of Elena's death, it was Enzo. She began to spend more time with him, accompanying him on his daily walks through the villa's gardens, listening to his stories, his reminiscences, his cryptic pronouncements. She asked him about the family's past, about their traditions, about their enemies. She subtly steered the conversation towards Elena, mentioning her name in passing, observing Enzo's reaction, looking for any flicker of emotion, any hint of the truth. At first, Enzo was evasive, reluctant to speak about Elena. He would change the subject, offer vague generalities, or simply fall silent, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. But Bianca persisted, patiently, persistently, chipping away at his defenses, earning his trust, slowly but surely. One afternoon, as they sat together on a bench overlooking the sea, Bianca decided to take a risk. She had noticed a small, almost imperceptible tremor in Enzo's hand when she had mentioned Elena's name earlier that day. It was a fleeting sign, a subtle betrayal of his carefully constructed composure, but it was enough to give Bianca hope. "Enzo," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with compassion. "I know that Elena's death was a tragedy. I know that it affected Matteo deeply. But I also sense that there's more to the story, something that hasn't been told, something that's being kept secret." Enzo remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the crashing waves below. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of salt and sea, a reminder of the vast, unpredictable power of nature, of the fragility of human life. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the sound of the wind. "Elena," he said, "was a mistake. A beautiful mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. She was not strong enough for this world. She was not Greco." "What happened to her?" Bianca asked, her voice trembling slightly. Enzo sighed, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of the past was pressing down on him.
"She fell," he said.
"From the cliffs. It was ruled an accident. But you don't believe that, do you?" Bianca pressed, her eyes searching his. Enzo looked at her, his gaze piercing, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. "There are things," he said, "that are best left unsaid. Secrets that are best kept buried. The past is the past, Bianca.
It cannot be changed.
It can only be endured." "But the past affects the present," Bianca argued. "It shapes who we are, it influences our decisions, it haunts our dreams. We can't simply ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist." Enzo nodded slowly, acknowledging her words. "You are right," he said. "The past does haunt us. It casts a long shadow over our lives. But sometimes, it is better to live in the shadows than to face the full glare of the truth." He stood up, his movements stiff and slow. "Matteo loved her, you know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He blamed himself. He never forgave himself." He turned to leave, and Bianca thought he'd retreat into silence again, but then he spoke, one final sentence. "It was Lorenzo who found her." And with that, he walked away, leaving Bianca alone with her thoughts, with the echoes of the past swirling around her, with the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on her heart. Lorenzo. The name again. It circled, a vulture, around her, and she was starting to understand the shape of its wings. Chapter 10. A Dance of Deception. Enzo's parting words, "It was Lorenzo who found her," reverberated in Bianca's mind, a chilling revelation that confirmed her suspicions and deepened the mystery surrounding Elena's death. Lorenzo, the man who had been present at the fall of the Vitali Empire, the man whose name Matteo had acknowledged with that almost imperceptible nod. He was a key player in this dark drama, a link between the past and the present, a figure shrouded in secrecy and suspicion. Bianca knew that she had to learn more about Lorenzo, about his relationship with Elena, about his role in the Greco family. But she also knew that she had to proceed with extreme caution. Lorenzo was a dangerous man, a powerful man, a man with connections to both the Vitales and the Grecos. Any direct confrontation could be disastrous, not only for her, but for Matteo and her father as well. She decided to use her newfound understanding of the Greco communication style to her advantage. She wouldn't ask direct questions, she would observe, listen, and subtly manipulate the conversations around her to glean the information she needed. She would use the silence, the whispers, the unspoken messages, to her advantage. She began to spend more time with Marco, Matteo's consigliere, a man who seemed to know everything that was happening within the Greco family, and perhaps even beyond. Marco was a master of observation, a collector of secrets, a strategist who always seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else. Bianca cultivated a relationship with Marco, not of friendship, but of mutual respect. She showed him that she was intelligent, observant, and discreet. She demonstrated her understanding of the Mafia's intricate workings, her ability to read between the lines, to decipher the unspoken messages that flowed beneath the surface of their conversations. She subtly steered their discussions towards Lorenzo, mentioning his name in passing, observing Marco's reaction, looking for any flicker of emotion, any hint of the truth. She learned that Lorenzo was a distant cousin of Matteo's, a man who had always been on the fringes of the family, but who had gained influence and power in recent years. He was known for his ruthlessness, his ambition, and his discretion. One evening, as Bianca and Marco were discussing a potential business deal, Bianca casually mentioned Lorenzo's name, suggesting that he might be a valuable asset in the negotiations. Marco's reaction was subtle, but telling. He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, his expression shifting from one of professional detachment to something more guarded, more wary. Lorenzo, Marco said, his voice carefully neutral, is a complicated man. He has his own agenda, his own ambitions. He is not always reliable. But he is loyal to the family, is he not? Bianca asked, her voice innocent, her eyes searching Marco's. Marco hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. Loyalty, he said, is a fluid concept in our world. It can shift, it can change, it can be bought. Bianca sensed that she was getting closer to the truth. Marco was clearly uncomfortable talking about Lorenzo, suggesting that there was something he was hiding, something he was reluctant to reveal. She decided to press further, but subtly, indirectly. She began to talk about Elena, about her tragic death, about the impact it had on Matteo. She expressed her sympathy, her compassion, her desire to understand the past. It must have been devastating for Matteo, Bianca said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with empathy. To lose someone he loved so suddenly, so tragically. Marco nodded, his expression softening slightly.
It was, he said.
It changed him. It made him harder, more cautious. And Lorenzo? Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper. How did he react? Marco's gaze flickered towards hers, then quickly away. He seemed to be struggling with himself, torn between his loyalty to Matteo and his something else. Fear? Guilt? Bianca couldn't quite decipher it. Lorenzo, Marco said, his voice low and strained, was supportive. He helped Matteo through the difficult time. He was there for him. He found her, didn't he? Bianca added softly. Marco remained silent. It was a thick, heavy silence. And that, Bianca knew, was as good as a shout. The dance of deception was delicate, dangerous, but Bianca was starting to master the steps. She knew that she was playing with fire, that one wrong move could expose her, could put her in grave danger. But she was also driven by a fierce determination to uncover the truth, to protect Matteo, to find justice for Elena. She had to find the balance. She was close to uncovering the full story, and she suspected it was more twisted than even she was prepared for. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom. The weight of Marco's silence, his unspoken confirmation of Lorenzo's involvement in Elena's death, hung heavy on Bianca's heart. She was getting closer to the truth, but the closer she got, the more dangerous the game became. She was navigating a treacherous labyrinth of secrets and lies, where one wrong step could lead to disaster. She knew that she couldn't confront Lorenzo directly. He was too powerful, too cunning, too dangerous. She had to find another way, a more indirect approach, to expose his guilt, to bring him to justice. She needed proof, concrete evidence that would link him to Elena's death, evidence that would withstand the scrutiny of the Greco family, of the Mafia's twisted code of honor. She decided to focus on her father. Antonio Vitali was a broken man, stripped of his power, his wealth, his dignity. He was living under Matteo's protection, but he was also a prisoner, his life hanging by a thread. Bianca knew that her father had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, that had led to their downfall. But she also loved him. She felt a sense of responsibility for him, a desire to protect him, to redeem him if possible. She began to visit her father regularly, spending hours with him, talking to him, listening to his regrets, his remorse, his fears. She tried to rebuild their relationship, to forge a new bond based on honesty, on trust, on a shared understanding of the mistakes they had both made. She subtly steered their conversations towards Lorenzo, mentioning his name in passing, observing her father's reaction, looking for any flicker of emotion, any hint of the truth. At first, Antonio was reluctant to speak about Lorenzo. He was afraid, ashamed, unwilling to revisit the events that had led to his downfall. "Lorenzo," Antonio said one afternoon, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and loathing, "is a snake. A viper. He betrayed me. He betrayed us all."
"How?"
Bianca asked, her voice gentle, her eyes encouraging. "Tell me what happened, father. Tell me everything." Antonio hesitated, his gaze shifting around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. He was still a prisoner, even in his own home, surrounded by Matteo's men, constantly under surveillance. "It was Lorenzo," Antonio finally said, his voice barely a whisper, "who orchestrated the whole thing. He manipulated me, he played me, he set me up. He wanted the Greco deal for himself. He wanted you for himself." Bianca felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed by her father, to hear the raw, unfiltered truth, was still a shock. Lorenzo had not only betrayed her father, he had coveted her. He had seen her as a prize to be won, a pawn in his twisted game of power. "And Elena?" Bianca asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What was his role in her death?" Antonio's eyes filled with tears. "He used her," he said. "He manipulated her. He seduced her. He eliminated her. He made it look like an accident, but it was murder." Bianca felt a surge of rage, of revulsion, of a fierce determination to bring Lorenzo to justice. He was a monster, a predator, a man who had destroyed lives, ruined families, all for his own selfish ambition. "I need proof, father," Bianca said, her voice firm, her eyes unwavering. "I need evidence that will link Lorenzo to Elena's death, to your downfall. I need something that will convince Matteo, that will expose Lorenzo for what he is." Antonio looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of hope and despair.
"There is nothing," he said.
"Lorenzo is too careful. He covers his tracks. He leaves no trace." "There must be something," Bianca insisted. "Some witness, some document, some anything." Antonio hesitated, his mind racing, searching his memory for any clue, any detail that might help his daughter, that might redeem him in her eyes. Suddenly, his eyes lit up, a flicker of recognition, of hope, illuminating his weary face. "The watch," he said. "Elena's watch. It was a gift from Matteo. A family heirloom. She always wore it. It was gone when they found her body." He grasped her hands. "If you can find that watch, Bianca, it could have the proof." Bianca felt a surge of adrenaline, of renewed determination. The watch. A tangible piece of evidence, a link to Elena, a potential key to unlocking the mystery of her death. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only lead she had. She stood, a new fire burning within her. It was a risk, a massive risk. But to free herself, and potentially her father as well, it was a risk worth taking. The price of freedom was steep, but she was ready to pay. Chapter 12. Under a Sky of Secrets. The revelation about Elena's watch, a missing family heirloom that could potentially link Lorenzo to her death, gave Bianca a renewed sense of purpose. It was a tangible clue, a thread she could follow in the labyrinthine maze of secrets and lies that surrounded the Greco family. But she knew that finding the watch would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, a daunting task that would require all her cunning, her resourcefulness, and her courage. She couldn't simply ask Matteo about the watch. He would immediately become suspicious, question her motives, and likely shut down any further inquiries. She had to find another way, a more subtle approach, to gather information, to track down the missing timepiece. She decided to start with Isabella, Matteo's sister, who had been her closest confidant within the Greco household. Isabella had been reluctant to speak about Elena's death, but she had also shown a genuine empathy for Bianca, a willingness to help her navigate the treacherous waters of their family's world. Bianca approached Isabella cautiously, framing her questions as a desire to learn more about Matteo's past, to understand the woman he had loved, to honor her memory. She mentioned Elena's watch in passing, describing it as a beautiful piece of jewelry, a symbol of Matteo's affection, a memento that he must surely cherish. "I've never seen Matteo wear it," Bianca said casually as they were walking through the villa's gardens one afternoon. "Does he keep it locked away somewhere safe?" Isabella hesitated, her gaze shifting away from Bianca's. "The watch," she said, her voice low and strained, "was lost. At the time of Elena's accident." "Lost?"
Bianca feignait de surprise.
"How tragic. Such a beautiful piece, with so much sentimental value. It must have been devastating for Matteo." Isabella nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Fear? Guilt? Bianca couldn't quite decipher it. It was, Isabella said. "He searched for it. Everywhere. He turned the villa upside down, questioned everyone, even accused some of us." "Accused?"
Bianca pressed gently.
"Who did he accuse?" Isabella hesitated again, her gaze darting around the garden, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "He suspected Lorenzo," she whispered. "He thought Lorenzo might have taken it." Bianca felt a surge of excitement, of confirmation. Matteo had suspected Lorenzo, too. That meant her instincts were right, that she was on the right track. But why would Lorenzo take it? Bianca asked, her voice innocent, her eyes wide with feigned curiosity. Isabella shook her head, her expression troubled.
"I don't know," she said.
"It doesn't make sense. Lorenzo had no reason to harm Elena. He was fond of her." Bianca knew that Isabella was either lying or incredibly naive. Lorenzo had every reason to harm Elena. He had used her, manipulated her, and then disposed of her when she was no longer useful to him. He was a monster, a predator, and Bianca was determined to expose him. She continued to gather information, piecing together the puzzle, bit by bit. She learned that the watch was a unique piece, a vintage design with a distinctive inscription on the back, Amore Eterno, eternal love. It was a valuable piece, but its true worth was sentimental, a symbol of Matteo's love for Elena, a link to his past. Bianca decided to take a risk. She knew that Lorenzo had a villa not far from the Greco estate. She'd used the cover of night. She knew it was dangerous, potentially deadly, but she was driven by a fierce determination to find the watch, to uncover the truth, to bring Lorenzo to justice. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The sea crashed restlessly below. The sky itself seemed to mirror the churning turmoil within her. She had dressed in dark clothing, blending into the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She slipped out of the Greco villa unnoticed, making her way through the darkened gardens, across the sprawling grounds, towards Lorenzo's estate. The air was thick with the scent of salt and sea, with the faint, lingering aroma of jasmine and roses. The closer she came, the more intense the silence became. And the more dangerous she knew it was becoming. It was a gamble, the largest she'd taken, and as she scaled the outer wall of Lorenzo's estate, she wondered if it would, in fact, be her last. Chapter 13. The Serpent's Embrace. The grounds of Lorenzo's villa were shrouded in darkness, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves in the night breeze and the distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore. Bianca moved like a shadow, her senses on high alert, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she was trespassing on dangerous territory, that one wrong step, one creak of a floorboard, one flicker of light, could betray her presence and lead to disastrous consequences. She had studied the layout of the villa from afar, using binoculars during the day, memorizing the location of the windows, the doors, the security cameras. She knew that Lorenzo was a cautious man, a man who took precautions, a man who surrounded himself with guards and surveillance systems. But she was determined to find the watch, to uncover the truth, to bring him to justice. She made her way through the gardens, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the well-lit paths, her footsteps silent on the soft earth. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, a heady, intoxicating fragrance that seemed to heighten her senses, to sharpen her awareness. She reached the villa, a sprawling, modern structure that contrasted sharply with the Greco's ancient, fortress-like estate. Lorenzo's villa was a testament to his wealth, his power, his ambition, a symbol of his ruthless ascent within the Mafia hierarchy. Bianca circled the villa, looking for a way in a vulnerable point, a crack in the fortress. She found it in a small, unlocked window on the ground floor, leading to what appeared to be a study or a library. It was a risky choice, a potential trap, but it was the only option she had. She carefully opened the window, slipping inside, her body tense, her muscles coiled, ready for anything. The room was dark, the only light filtering in from the moonlit sky outside. She could make out the shapes of bookshelves, a large desk, a leather armchair, the faint outline of paintings on the walls. She moved slowly, deliberately, her senses scanning the room, searching for any sign of danger, any indication of Lorenzo's presence. She could hear the faint ticking of a clock, the soft rustling of papers, the distant murmur of voices from another part of the villa. She began her search, starting with the desk, carefully opening drawers, sifting through papers, looking for any clue, any hint of the watch's whereabouts. She found nothing, only documents related to Lorenzo's business dealings, his illicit transactions, his web of connections within the Mafia underworld. She moved on to the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines of the books, searching for a hidden compartment, a secret safe, anything that might conceal the watch. She found nothing, only dusty tomes, ancient manuscripts, and modern thrillers, a testament to Lorenzo's eclectic tastes. She was about to give up, to conclude that the watch was not in the study, when she noticed something unusual. One of the paintings on the wall, a large, abstract canvas, seemed slightly askew, as if it had been moved recently, as if it was concealing something. She approached the painting, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses tingling with anticipation. She carefully lifted the canvas, revealing a small, hidden safe embedded in the wall. It was a combination lock, a sophisticated security system that would be difficult to crack. She hesitated, her mind racing, trying to decide what to do. She didn't have the combination, and she didn't have the time to try to force it open. She was about to give up, to admit defeat, when she remembered something Enzo had told her, a seemingly insignificant detail about Lorenzo's past. Lorenzo, Enzo had said, is a sentimental fool. He hides his secrets behind his memories. Bianca realized that the combination to the safe must be something personal, something meaningful to Lorenzo, something related to his past. She thought for a moment, trying to recall any detail, any clue that might help her. Then it hit her.
Elena.
The combination must be related to Elena, to their relationship, to her death. She tried Elena's birth date. Nothing. She tried the date of her death. Nothing. She was about to give up, to conclude that she was wrong, when she remembered something else, something Isabella had told her. Elena had a favorite flower, a white gardenia, that she always wore in her hair. And gardenias bloomed in May. She tried the month and year of Elena's death, with the number 5 for the month of May. She entered the numbers slowly, deliberately, her hand trembling with anticipation. She heard a click, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, and the safe door swung open. And there it was. Lying on a velvet cushion, gleaming in the faint moonlight, was Elena's watch. The inscription, Amore Eterno, was clearly visible. As she reached for it, a voice came from the doorway.
Cold.
Threatening. Looking for something, Bianca? Bianca froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She slowly turned, her hand still outstretched towards the watch, and found herself face to face with Lorenzo. He was holding a gun, its barrel pointed directly at her heart. Chapter 14. Cracks in the Facade. Lorenzo's voice, dripping with a chilling calmness, sliced through the silence of the study. The sight of him, silhouetted in the doorway, the gun glinting ominously in the moonlight, sent a wave of fear washing over Bianca. She had been so close, so incredibly close to finding the proof she needed, only to be caught in the serpent's embrace. Lorenzo, Bianca said, forcing herself to remain calm, to keep her voice steady, betraying none of the terror she felt inside. I was just looking around. Lorenzo chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. Looking around? He repeated, his eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on her with a predatory intensity. In my study? In the middle of the night? I think not, Signora Greco. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing like a death knell. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his body language radiating power, menace, and a chilling confidence. He knew he had her trapped, and he was relishing the moment. I know why you're here, Bianca, Lorenzo said, his voice softening slightly, taking on a seductive tone. You're looking for Elena's watch. You think it will somehow incriminate me. It's the truth, isn't it? Bianca challenged, her gaze unwavering, her voice gaining strength. You killed her. You murdered her and made it look like an accident. Lorenzo smiled, a cruel, predatory smile that revealed his teeth, stained yellow from years of expensive cigars. Elena, he said, was a liability, a weakness, a loose end. She knew too much. She was disposable. Bianca felt a surge of rage, of revulsion, but she forced herself to remain calm, to control her emotions. She knew that she was in a precarious situation, that one wrong move, one outburst of anger, could cost her her life. You're a monster, Bianca said, her voice low and steady. Lorenzo shrugged, his expression indifferent. Perhaps, he said. But I am also a survivor. I do what I must to protect myself, to advance my interests, to thrive. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, his gaze locking onto hers. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. His touch was surprisingly soft, sending a shiver of disgust down her spine. You know, Bianca, Lorenzo said, his voice a seductive whisper, I always admired you. Your beauty, your intelligence, your fire. You remind me of Elena. But you are stronger. You are smarter. You could be a valuable asset to me. Bianca felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew what he was implying. He was offering her a choice. Join him, become his accomplice, his lover, or face the consequences. I will never join you, Bianca said, her voice firm, her eyes blazing with defiance. I will never be like you. Lorenzo's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation.
A pity, he said.
You had such potential. But I see now that you're just like Elena.
Weak.
Naive. Destined to fail. He raised the gun, pointing it directly at her forehead. Bianca closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable, her mind racing, searching for any way out, any chance of survival. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the doorway. Lorenzo! Drop the gun. It was Matteo. He stood there, his face a mask of fury, his own gun drawn and aimed at Lorenzo. Behind him stood Marco, his expression grim, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife. Lorenzo slowly turned, his eyes widening in surprise, his expression shifting from one of confidence to one of fear. He hadn't expected Matteo, hadn't anticipated his intervention. Matteo, Lorenzo said, his voice trembling slightly, trying to regain his composure. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, Matteo said, his voice cold, his eyes blazing with anger. What are you doing with my wife? Why are you pointing a gun at her? She was snooping, Lorenzo stammered, his gaze darting between Matteo and Bianca. She was looking for evidence. She was trying to frame me. Evidence of what? Matteo demanded, his voice rising in volume. Evidence of your betrayal? Evidence of your murder? Lorenzo's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped, exposed, his carefully constructed facade crumbling around him. Matteo stepped into the room, his gun still trained on Lorenzo. The facade was cracking, and as Matteo advanced, Bianca knew the truth was about to break free. The silence had held its secrets for too long, and now, under a sky of secrets no more, it was ready to speak. Chapter 15. The Heart's Betrayal. The air in Lorenzo's study crackled with tension, the silence punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the three figures locked in a deadly standoff. Matteo's fury was a palpable force, radiating from him in waves, his eyes blazing with a mixture of betrayal and rage. Lorenzo, his usual composure shattered, stood trembling, his face pale, his eyes darting between Matteo and Bianca, searching for an escape, a way out of the trap he had sprung upon himself. "I ask you a question, Lorenzo," Matteo repeated, his voice dangerously low, his gun unwavering. What evidence was Bianca looking for? Evidence of what? Lorenzo swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing nervously. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some lie, some excuse, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He knew that he was cornered, that his carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the monstrous truth beneath. "Answer him, Lorenzo," Bianca said, her voice surprisingly calm, her gaze fixed on the man who had betrayed her father, murdered Elena, and threatened her own life. "Tell him the truth. Tell him everything." Lorenzo looked at Bianca, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and something else. Was it regret? Remorse? Or simply the fear of a cornered animal facing its inevitable demise? Lorenzo stammered, his voice trembling. I didn't kill her. It was an accident.
She fell."
"Liar," Matteo roared, his voice echoing through the room. "You murdered her. You murdered Elena, just like you betrayed my father, just like you tried to take Bianca from me." Lorenzo flinched, his body recoiling as if struck by a physical blow. He knew that Matteo was right, that he had been found out, that his game was over. "It was business," Lorenzo finally said, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes pleading with Matteo for understanding, for mercy. "She knew too much. She was a threat. I had to silence her." Matteo's face contorted in a mask of grief and rage. He took a step closer to Lorenzo, his gun hand trembling, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You killed her," Matteo said, his voice choked with emotion. "You killed the woman I loved. You monster." Bianca saw the look in Matteo's eyes, the raw, unadulterated fury, the overwhelming desire for revenge. She knew that he was about to kill Lorenzo, that he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return.
"Matteo, no."
Bianca cried, stepping forward, placing herself between Matteo and Lorenzo. "Don't do it. Don't become like him. Don't let him turn you into a murderer." Matteo hesitated, his gaze shifting from Lorenzo to Bianca, his eyes filled with a conflict of emotions. He was torn between his desire for revenge and his something for Bianca. Respect? Affection? Love? It was impossible to tell. "He deserves to die," Matteo said, his voice raw with emotion. "He deserves to suffer for what he did." "I know," Bianca said, her voice gentle, her eyes pleading. "But killing him won't bring Elena back. It won't erase the pain. It will only make things worse. It will destroy you." Matteo stood there, frozen, his body trembling, his mind wrestling with the conflicting forces of rage and reason, of vengeance and compassion. He looked at Bianca, his eyes searching hers, looking for guidance, for strength, for a way out of the darkness that threatened to consume him. Finally, he lowered his gun, his hand still shaking, his body still tense with barely contained fury. He turned to Marco, his consigliera, who had been a silent witness to the entire scene. "Take him," Matteo said, his voice hoarse, his words clipped. "Take him away. Lock him up. I'll deal with him later." Marco nodded, his expression grim, his hand still resting on the hilt of his knife. He stepped forward, grabbing Lorenzo by the arm, pulling him roughly out of the room. Lorenzo didn't resist, didn't protest. He was a broken man, stripped of his power, his dignity, his very soul. Matteo turned to Bianca, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something more. He reached out and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheekbone. His touch was surprisingly tender, sending a shiver down her spine. It was perhaps the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. The raw emotion, exposed for her, was a powerful thing. And in that moment, Bianca realized the depth of her own feelings. She cared for him, deeply. It was not the love of fairy tales, but it was real. It was born of shared struggle, of mutual respect, and of the slow, painstaking process of breaking down the walls between them. "Thank you," Matteo said, his voice a soft whisper. "You saved me. You saved me from myself." Bianca smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile that reflected the relief, the gratitude, the burgeoning affection she felt for this complex, tormented man. "We saved each other," Bianca said, her voice equally soft, her eyes locking onto his. And for the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy and oppressive. It was charged with a new kind of energy, with understanding, and with something that might be, one day, love. Chapter 16. A Web of Lies. The aftermath of Lorenzo's capture was a whirlwind of activity, of hushed conversations, of veiled threats, of the intricate workings of Mafia justice. Matteo, his facade of icy control shattered by the confrontation, retreated into himself, becoming even more withdrawn, more unapproachable. He dealt with Lorenzo swiftly and brutally, stripping him of his power, his wealth, his status within the family. Lorenzo was banished, exiled to a remote island, his life spared, but his existence reduced to a shadow, a ghost of his former self. Bianca, however, couldn't simply move on. The discovery of Elena's watch, Lorenzo's confession, had opened a Pandora's box of secrets and lies, revealing a web of deceit that extended far beyond the Greco family, reaching into the highest echelons of Italian society, of the global underworld. She knew that Lorenzo hadn't acted alone. He had been a pawn, a player in a larger game, a game orchestrated by powerful, shadowy figures who operated behind the scenes, pulling the strings, manipulating events to their own advantage. She was determined to uncover the truth, to expose the masterminds behind Lorenzo's crimes, to bring them to justice. She began her own investigation, quietly, discreetly, using her newfound status within the Greco family, her access to information, her growing network of contacts, to gather clues, to piece together the puzzle. She spent hours in the library, poring over old family records, financial documents, legal papers, searching for any hint of the truth. She spoke to Enzo, to Marco, to Isabella, subtly probing, carefully questioning, trying to glean any information they might possess, any knowledge they might be willing to share. She discovered that Lorenzo had been involved in a vast money laundering scheme, a complex network of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and illicit transactions that implicated not only members of the Greco and Vitali families, but also prominent politicians, business leaders, and even members of law enforcement. The web of lies was intricate, extensive, and deeply rooted in the fabric of Italian society. It was a conspiracy that threatened to topple governments, to destabilize economies, to expose the dark underbelly of power and corruption that lurked beneath the surface of a seemingly respectable world. Bianca knew that she was playing a dangerous game, that she was treading on treacherous ground. She was challenging powerful forces, individuals who would not hesitate to silence her, to eliminate her, to protect their secrets, their interests, their very survival. She confided in Marco, Matteo's consigliere, sharing her suspicions, her findings, her fears. Marco was a man of few words, but he was also a man of unwavering loyalty, of impeccable judgment, of a deep understanding of the Mafia's intricate workings. He listened to Bianca's concerns, assessed the evidence, and offered his cautious support. "You are walking a tightrope, Bianca," Marco warned her. "One wrong step, one miscalculation could be fatal. These people, they are not to be trifled with." "I know," Bianca said, her voice firm, her eyes unwavering. "But I can't simply stand by and do nothing. I can't ignore the truth. I have to expose them." Marco nodded, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Then be careful," he said. "Be very careful. And trust no one." Bianca heeded Marco's warning, proceeding with extreme caution, guarding her secrets, sharing her findings only with those she absolutely trusted. She knew that she was surrounded by enemies, that even within the Greco family, there were those who might betray her, who might be working for the other side. One evening, as she was working late in the library, she stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf, a secret safe containing a cache of documents, letters, and photographs that revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. It was a treasure trove of evidence, a smoking gun that could bring down the entire network of corruption. Among the documents was a letter, a handwritten note from her father to Lorenzo. It confirmed everything. Antonio Vitali had, initially, been a willing participant in the scheme. Bianca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She'd hoped, despite everything, that her father had been completely manipulated, that he was only a victim.
The truth stung deeply.
She knew that she had to share this information with Matteo. But as she reached for the documents, she heard a noise behind her. She turned, a gasp escaping her lips. Standing in the doorway was Enzo, Matteo's uncle. He was not alone. Beside him was a man Bianca had seen before. DeMarco. The man who had orchestrated her father's downfall, the man who had delivered her to the Grecos. And in his hand, he held a gun. Chapter 17. The Unraveling. The sight of Enzo, Matteo's uncle, standing alongside DeMarco, the architect of her father's ruin, sent a wave of shock and dread through Bianca. The hidden compartment, the incriminating documents, the web of lies she had so painstakingly uncovered, all of it seemed to pale in comparison to this unexpected, terrifying confrontation. Enzo, Bianca said, her voice trembling slightly, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. Well, what is the meaning of this? Enzo's face, usually a mask of stoic indifference, was etched with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. He looked old, weary, defeated. I'm sorry, Bianca, Enzo said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the pounding of her heart. It's over. You know too much. DeMarco, his usual smug arrogance replaced by a cold, calculating demeanor, stepped forward, his gun trained on Bianca. You should have stayed out of it, Signora Greco, DeMarco said, his voice dripping with disdain. You should have played the part of the dutiful wife, the silent ornament. But you couldn't resist, could you? You had to dig. Bianca felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but she forced herself to remain calm, to think strategically. She was trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. But she was also a Vitali, a Greco, a survivor. She wouldn't go down without a fight. What do you want? Bianca asked, her voice steady, her gaze fixed on DeMarco. We want the documents, DeMarco said, gesturing towards the hidden safe. And we want you silenced. Permanently. Bianca knew that she couldn't simply hand over the documents. They were the key to exposing the entire conspiracy, to bringing down the powerful figures who had orchestrated Lorenzo's crimes, who had manipulated her family, who had threatened her life. I don't have them, Bianca lied, her voice unwavering, her eyes meeting DeMarco's. I burned them. DeMarco chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. You're lying, he said. We know you have them. Enzo saw you. He informed us. Bianca turned to Enzo, her eyes filled with betrayal and disbelief. You? She said, her voice barely a whisper. You betrayed me? You betrayed Matteo? Enzo looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor, his shoulders slumping in shame. I had no choice, he said. They threatened me. They threatened my family. They threatened everything. Bianca realized that Enzo was not a villain, but a victim, a pawn in a larger game, just like her father, just like Elena, just like so many others. He had been coerced, manipulated, forced to betray his own family, his own principles, to protect those he loved. Who? Bianca asked, her voice rising in volume. Who threatened you? Who is behind all of this? Enzo hesitated, his gaze darting between Bianca and DeMarco, his face a mask of fear and conflict. He opened his mouth to speak, to reveal the truth, but DeMarco cut him off. Enough. DeMarco barked, his voice sharp, his gun hand tightening. It doesn't matter who. What matters is that you hand over the documents, or you die. Bianca knew that she had to buy time, to stall for time, to find a way out of this impossible situation. She had to think fast, to use her wits, her cunning, her knowledge of the Greco family, of the Mafia's intricate workings, to her advantage. "You think Matteo will let this pass?" Bianca said, looking directly at DeMarco. "He will hunt you down. All of you." DeMarco smirked. "Matteo is occupied. He won't be a problem." Bianca's blood turned cold. Occupied. What had they done? "Where is he?" she demanded. "Let's just say," DeMarco began, stepping closer, the gun now inches from her face. "He's had a bit of an accident." Enzo finally reacted, stepping forward.
No.
"We were told he would not be harmed. That was the agreement." DeMarco turned on him, fury in his eyes. "The agreement has changed, old man." He turned back to Bianca.
"Now."
"The documents." Bianca knew she had mere seconds. Everything was unraveling, and it was happening too fast. She lunged. It wasn't a calculated move. It was pure desperation. She knocked the gun from DeMarco's hand, a small, sharp cry escaping her as she did so. The sound of the shot was deafening, the pain immediate, a searing agony that tore through her shoulder. She stumbled, fell, her hand clutching at the wound, the crimson stain spreading quickly across her dress. The documents scattered, a flurry of paper, of secrets, of lies, falling around her like confetti. She heard Enzo shouting, then a sickening thud. The world was blurring, the sounds fading. She could feel herself slipping, losing consciousness, the darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. She was surrounded.
She was betrayed.
And she didn't know if Matteo was alive or dead. Chapter 18. The Reckoning. The world swam back into focus through a haze of pain and disorientation. Bianca lay on the floor of the library, her shoulder throbbing, her dress soaked in blood. The scent of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mingling with the musty smell of old books and the metallic tang of her own blood. She could hear voices, muffled and distorted, arguing in the distance. Enzo's voice, filled with a desperate urgency, and DeMarco's, cold and calculating. She tried to move, to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, forcing her to lie still, her head spinning, her vision blurred. She had been shot, betrayed, left for dead. But she was still alive, still breathing, still clinging to a flicker of hope, a desperate determination to survive, to expose the conspiracy, to avenge the wrongs that had been done. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing, trying to control the pain, to regain her strength, to gather her thoughts. She had to find a way out of this, to escape, to warn Matteo. To Matteo. The thought of him, the image of his face, his strong, determined features, his eyes filled with a mixture of darkness and something more, gave her a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. She had to get to him, to find out what had happened to him, to make sure he was safe. She slowly, painfully, pushed herself up into a sitting position, her shoulders screaming in protest, her head swimming with dizziness. She leaned against the bookshelf, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked around the room, her vision slowly clearing. The documents she had discovered, the evidence of the vast conspiracy, lay scattered across the floor, a jumble of papers, letters, and photographs. DeMarco and Enzo were gone, their argument having moved elsewhere, leaving her alone in the wreckage of her shattered hopes. She had to get out of here, to find help, to warn Matteo. She crawled towards the door, her body aching, her shoulder throbbing, her dress trailing blood behind her. She reached the door, pulling herself up, using the doorknob for support. She opened the door, peering out into the corridor. It was empty, silent, the only light filtering in from the distant windows. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the ordeal ahead. She stumbled out of the library, making her way through the darkened corridors, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had to reach the main entrance, to escape the villa, to find someone, anyone, who could help her. She found Marco. Or, rather, he found her. He was standing there in the main hallway, his arms crossed. His face was unreadable. "Marco," Bianca gasped, relief flooding through her, momentarily overwhelming the pain. "Thank God." DeMarco, Enzo, he held up a hand, silencing her. I know, he said, his voice quiet. He stepped closer and Bianca saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't concern. It wasn't relief. It was cold, calculating. Bianca recoiled, her heart sinking with a terrifying realization.
Marco.
All this time, it was him. She whispered, her voice barely audible. He smiled, a cruel, chilling smile that sent shivers down her spine.
Surprised, Bianca?
He asked, his voice dripping with a false sympathy. Did you really think you could unravel all of this without my knowledge? Without my guidance? The reckoning had come, and it was far more devastating than she could have ever imagined. Marco, the trusted consigliere, the man she had confided in, had been playing her all along. He was the mastermind, the puppet master, the architect of the entire conspiracy. And now he had her cornered. Chapter 19. Beyond Redemption. Marco's revelation, his cold, calculating smile, his admission of guilt, hit Bianca with the force of a physical blow. The trusted consigliere, the man she had confided in, the man who had seemingly offered his support, had been playing her all along. He was the mastermind, the architect of the conspiracy, the puppet master pulling the strings from the shadows. You, Bianca whispered, her voice trembling, her mind reeling from the shock, the betrayal, the sheer audacity of his deception. All this time it was you? Marco nodded, his smile widening, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and disdain. Of course, it was me, Bianca, he said, his voice smooth, his tone condescending. Who else could orchestrate such a complex, intricate web of deceit? Who else could manipulate so many powerful figures, so many influential players, to achieve their own ambitions? Bianca felt a surge of anger, of rage, of a fierce determination to fight back, to resist, to expose him for the monster he was. But she was also weak, wounded, her body aching, her shoulder throbbing, her strength ebbing away.
Why?
Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes searching his, looking for any flicker of humanity, any hint of remorse, any explanation for his monstrous actions. Marco shrugged, his expression indifferent. Power, Bianca, he said. Influence. Control. The usual motivations. I grew tired of being a mere servant. I wanted more. I deserved more. And I took it. And Elena? Bianca asked, her voice trembling slightly. What was her role in all of this? Marco's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. Elena, he said, was a mistake. A loose end. A liability. She discovered my involvement with Lorenzo. She threatened to expose me. I had to silence her. Bianca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed by Marco himself, to hear the cold, calculating way he spoke of Elena's murder, sent a chill down her spine. And Matteo? Bianca asked, her voice filled with a desperate hope, a desperate plea. What have you done with Matteo? Marco smiled, a cruel, chilling smile that revealed his teeth, stained yellow from years of expensive cigars. Matteo, he said, is indisposed. He suffered a tragic accident. A boating mishap. I'm afraid he's gone. Bianca felt her heart shatter into a million pieces. Matteo.
Gone. Dead.
Murdered by the man she had trusted, the man who had been his closest advisor, his confidant, his friend. You're lying, Bianca said, her voice shaking, her eyes filling with tears. You're lying. Matteo is he's Marco shook his head, his expression unwavering. I'm afraid not, Bianca, he said. Matteo is no more. And soon you will join him. He reached out, grabbing her by the arm, his grip strong, his fingers digging into her flesh. Bianca tried to resist, to pull away, but she was too weak, too wounded, too overwhelmed by the pain, the grief, the sheer horror of the situation. He dragged her towards the hallway, and for a brief moment, she caught sight of the open doorway to the terrace, the very place where Elena had supposedly fallen. The place where she would now, in a cruel twist of fate, meet her own end. It's fitting, isn't it? Marco said, his voice a sinister whisper in her ear. You and Elena. Together. Forever silenced. But then a sound.
A roar.
A voice.
Marco.
It was Matteo. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, his face bruised and bloodied, his clothes torn and disheveled, but his eyes blazing with fury, with a fierce, unyielding determination. He was alive. He was here. And he was angry. Marco froze, his grip on Bianca's arm loosening slightly, his eyes widening in surprise, in disbelief, in fear. He hadn't expected Matteo, hadn't anticipated his survival. His carefully constructed plan, his intricate web of deceit, was unraveling, collapsing around him. Matteo charged, moving with a speed and agility that belied his injuries. He tackled Marco, sending them both crashing to the floor, a tangle of limbs, of rage, of a desperate struggle for survival. Bianca watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and terror. Matteo was alive, he was fighting, he was winning. The scene was a blur of motion, of violence, of raw, primal fury. Matteo, fueled by adrenaline, by rage, by a desperate desire for revenge, was overpowering Marco, pummeling him with his fists, his kicks, his sheer, unadulterated force of will. Marco was strong, Marco was cunning, but he was no match, at that moment, for Matteo. Finally, with a sickening thud, Marco's head made contact with the marble floor. His body went limp. Matteo stood, breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his face and body covered in blood and bruises. He looked at Bianca, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief, of concern, of love. "Bianca," he said, his voice hoarse, his words clipped. Are you all right?" Bianca nodded, her eyes filling with tears, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She was safe. Matteo was alive. They had survived. But the cost had been immense, the scars would remain, and the future was uncertain. The truth was out, the villains exposed, but redemption felt out of reach. Chapter 20. A New Dawn's Embrace. The aftermath of Marco's defeat was a period of healing, of reckoning, of rebuilding. The conspiracy he had orchestrated was exposed, the web of lies he had spun was unraveled, and the powerful figures he had manipulated were brought to justice. The Greco family, scarred but not broken, emerged from the darkness, stronger, more united, more determined to forge a new path, a new future. Matteo, his injuries slowly healing, his spirit tempered by the ordeal, took on the mantle of leadership with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that came with his power, his heritage, his name. He vowed to cleanse the family of corruption, to break free from the cycle of violence and deceit, to create a legacy worthy of respect, of honor, of love. Bianca, her own wounds slowly mending, her spirit unbroken, stood by Matteo's side, his partner, his confidant, his equal. She had proven her strength, her courage, her loyalty, not only to Matteo, but to herself. She had found her place within the Greco family, not as a pawn, not as a trophy, but as a force to be reckoned with, a woman of intelligence, of compassion, of unwavering determination. The villa, once a place of shadows, of secrets, of unspoken fears, was gradually transformed into a home, a sanctuary, a place of warmth, of laughter, of shared hopes and dreams. The silence that had once been so oppressive, so heavy, was replaced by the sounds of life, of love, of a family finding its way back to the light. Antonio Vitali, freed from his gilded cage, his spirit broken but his conscience clear, was given a chance to redeem himself, to rebuild his relationship with his daughter, to find peace in the twilight of his years. He apologized to Bianca, to Matteo, for his mistakes, his weaknesses, his complicity in the web of lies that had almost destroyed them all. He accepted his punishment, his exile, with a quiet dignity, a sense of resignation, a hope for forgiveness. Isabella, her rebellious spirit tempered by the events she had witnessed, became a valuable ally to Matteo and Bianca, her sharp wit, her keen intelligence, her unwavering loyalty, proving to be invaluable assets in the rebuilding of the family, the forging of a new future. Enzo, his betrayal forgiven but not forgotten, retreated into a quiet retirement, his conscience burdened by the choices he had made, his spirit haunted by the ghosts of the past. He sought solace in the gardens, in the beauty of nature, in the quiet contemplation of the sea, finding a measure of peace in the solitude, in the silence, in the acceptance of his own mortality. And as for Bianca and Matteo, they found in each other strength. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, they would carry with them. They would be a constant reminder of the pain they had endured, the betrayals they had suffered, the lives that had been lost. They took their time. They had to relearn, to rebuild, trust. One evening, they were out on the terrace, the sun setting on the horizon. "I thought I had lost you," Bianca said softly. Matteo took her hand. He didn't speak for a long while, his eyes on the sea. "And you," he finally replied. They stood like that, for a long time, holding each other, drawing strength from the other's presence. And as a new dawn slowly rose, a gentle breeze blew, carrying with it the scent of the sea, of the flowers, and, perhaps, a hint of a better future. A future where love and trust prevailed and where, even in the darkest of families, a glimmer of hope could flourish. Epilogue. 5 years had passed since the unraveling of Marco's conspiracy, since the shattering revelations that had rocked the Greco family to its core. 5 years of healing, of rebuilding, of forging a new path, a new future, a new legacy. The villa, once a symbol of darkness and deceit, now radiated a warmth, a sense of peace, a feeling of home. The gardens, meticulously tended, bloomed with vibrant colors, their fragrances mingling with the salty tang of the sea breeze. The silence that had once been so heavy, so oppressive, was now filled with the sounds of laughter, of conversation, of life. Bianca and Matteo stood on the terrace, overlooking the sea, their hands intertwined, their bodies close, their hearts filled with a quiet contentment, a deep, abiding love that had blossomed from the ashes of betrayal and loss. The scars of the past remained, etched on their bodies, their minds, their souls, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of their strength, their resilience, their ability to overcome adversity, to find light in the darkness, to build a future from the ruins of the past. Matteo, his once haunted eyes now filled with a gentle warmth, a quiet strength, had transformed the Greco family, cleansing it of corruption, breaking free from the cycle of violence, leading it towards a new era of integrity, of honor, of respect. He had become the leader he was always meant to be, a man of vision, of compassion, of unwavering commitment to his family, to his people, to his wife. Bianca, her own strength tempered by the fires of adversity, had found her place within the Greco family, not as an outsider, not as a pawn, but as a matriarch, a guiding force, a woman of wisdom, of courage, of unwavering loyalty. She had embraced her role, her responsibilities, her power, using it to heal, to rebuild, to create a better future for those she loved. Antonio Vitali, his health failing, his spirit humbled, had passed away peacefully in his sleep, his final days spent in the company of his daughter, his conscience clear, his heart filled with a quiet gratitude for the second chance he had been given, for the forgiveness he had received. Isabella, her rebellious spirit channeled into a force for good, had become a successful businesswoman, a philanthropist, a leader in her own right, using her intelligence, her wit, her connections to empower women, to support her community, to make a difference in the world. Enzo, his betrayal long forgiven, had found solace in the solitude of his gardens, in the quiet contemplation of nature, in the acceptance of his own mortality. He had made peace with his past, with his mistakes, with the choices he had made, finding a measure of redemption in the simple beauty of the world around him. And as for Bianca and Matteo, their love had deepened, strengthened, matured into something profound, something unbreakable, something that transcended the boundaries of their families, their pasts, their world. They had found in each other a soulmate, a partner, a friend, a lover, a confidant, a home. They looked toward horizon. The sky was painted with the soft pastels of a setting sun. Bianca spoke, her voice low, a gentle smile on her lips. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Matteo tightened his hold on her hand, his gaze meeting hers. "Yes," he replied softly. "It is." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sea, they stood together, silhouetted against the fading light, two figures united by love, by loss, by a shared journey through darkness and into a new dawn. A dawn that promised peace, happiness, and a future filled with the enduring power of hope, forgiveness, and unwavering love. The waves crashed, gently now, against the shore. A new day had come, and a new life had truly begun.